As I understand it, the official doctrine, if you like, of the sensus divinitatis, and this is the doctrine that traces back to John Calvin, says that all human beings, and not just Christians, are born with a God-given awareness or faculty or capacity for knowing God directly.
Yeah.
Calls it the sensus divinitatis, a sense of divinity. It's inborn in all human beings, says Calvin, and because it's innate in all human beings, Calvin says that no one has an excuse for being an atheist. So again, suppose that's true, and now consider the clustered distribution of theistic belief around the world that I referred to a moment ago, and think of the two rival explanations of that distribution that are now on offer. On the one hand, you've got naturalistic explanations that cite messy and haphazard factors like human conquest and politics. And on the other hand, you've got an explanation that presupposes this innate, God-given human faculty that for some reason works splendidly in Afghanistan and works terribly in Cambodia. And no innate capacity, of course, that we know of respects geographic boundaries in that way. So I would conclude it's unlikely that any sensus divinitatis exists.
Well, maybe there's some kind of spiritual disturbance in Cambodia, like maybe one of Satan's main angels is just camping out in the center, but they didn't send an archangel of Satan to Afghanistan.
You could say that. Then I would bring up Thailand next and force you to explain Thailand, and then we'll go on to Burma and Laos and wherever else we need to go in order to find a country that is overwhelmingly non-theistic. We'll need to contrast those with places like Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia and so on. It gets pretty ad hoc, at any rate, it seems to me, as an explanation of what we find. I'm not saying it's impossible to explain this clustering, but I think those explanations are less likely than the kinds we get from naturalism.
Well, it's always possible that there's a satanic archangel in each of those countries, so you can't rule it out.
No, you can't. You can't rule it out.
Well, let's talk about morality then. Most people seem to think that morality and religion are bound at the hip and that objective morality can be used as the basis of an argument for God's existence. But you argue that ordinary morality implies atheism instead. How does that argument work?
Your phrase bound at the hip is a nice way of putting it. Most Americans, for example, according to a recent survey anyway, mistakenly think that morality absolutely depends on religion, and for that reason atheists are morally untrustworthy.
Yeah.
An interesting result of a 2006 survey out of the University of Minnesota. But about morality, I think ordinary morality, as I call it, implies atheism in a number of ways, but I focused on only one of those ways in the article that I wrote on the topic, and I'll say more in a minute about the argument in that article, but I want to say I also wonder about some other problems. For instance, how do you square the theistic doctrine of heaven with our ordinary moral explanation of the wrongness of killing a child, for instance? If the doctrine of heaven is true, then a heaven-bound child goes to paradise upon being killed, but morality says that killing a child is wrong mainly because killing the child seriously harms the child. So which is it, harm or paradise? I can't see how to square the wrongness of killing with the doctrine of heaven. But let me get back to the argument I did give in that article.
Well, actually here, let me give what I think would be the most common theistic response to that is, I think Christians would say the wrongness of killing the child then is because it's disobedient to God. God has the right to take that child's life, but not you, and that's what's wrong with it. It's not that you're harming the child or not harming the child. It's wrong because you're disobeying God or something like that.
Yeah, and I think that response doesn't square easily with our ordinary moral reasoning about the wrongness of killing.
Yeah.
When we're talking about it in everyday contexts, we tend to regard killing someone as harming that person in a very serious way, maybe the most serious way, and that our killing being wrong for that reason. If in fact killing somebody sends him or her straight to paradise, then you're right, we have to come up with a very different reason for the wrongness of killing, and you've mentioned one, right? It usurps God's prerogative.
Right.
But notice that it locates the wrongness in a very different place from where I think our ordinary moral practice would locate it. Killing a child becomes an offense to God, not to the child. We think killing is wrong principally because of what it does to its victim, not what it does to some third party. But that's something I'll explore when I have more time. The argument that I gave from morality to atheism is different, though. And to be fair, I should point out that theists and atheists have worried about this problem, about the impact of theism on the moral obligations that we think we have, such as the obligation we at least sometimes have to prevent terrible suffering by children.
Mm-hmm.
We think we do have that obligation at least sometimes. And theists have worried, as atheists have, about the impact of theism on an obligation like that. So what I tried to do in my article is to show how God's perfection destroys our most serious moral obligations. The slogan I sometimes use is this: the better God is, the worse we're allowed to be. And it's an analog of another problem that stems from God's greatness, and that is that if God exists and is unsurpassably great, then God must be so great as to be totally inconceivable by us. So I've argued in a different article that Anselmian theism implies mysticism of the most radical kind.
Mm-hmm.
But let me get back to the moral argument. I'll unpack it a bit more. If God is perfect in knowledge, power, and goodness, then I claim God would never exploit a child by letting the child suffer horribly unless the suffering was required for the child's own greater good. To put it in a nutshell, no perfect being exploits kids. So God permits horrific suffering by children only when it's in their best interest. Their suffering is really like a painful but highly beneficial vaccination. In that case, however, if that's what's going on, we don't have the moral obligation that we always thought we had, the moral obligation to prevent the child's suffering, at least when we easily can. Because nobody thinks we have a moral obligation to prevent painful vaccinations that greatly benefit children. And even parents who are opposed to vaccinations on principle are opposed because they think vaccines harm children. Mm-hmm. If you think a painful vaccine greatly benefits your child, then you're not opposed to it. You don't think anybody has an obligation to prevent the vaccination. Well, if all that's right, then we never have a moral obligation to prevent horrific suffering by children. Because, again, the analog to horrific suffering by children is a painful vaccination that benefits the child. And I'm saying that has to be what's going on if the world is in the charge of a perfect being. And furthermore, if we don't have the obligation to prevent horrific suffering by children, even when we easily can, then I can't see how we have any moral obligations. If we don't have even that obligation, then morality falls apart, as far as I can see. And more generally, I think theism implies a crazy inverse relationship. This one, the worse a child's suffering is, the more reason we have for thinking that it's required for the child's own good, and so the less reason we have to prevent it. The worse the suffering, the less reason we have to prevent it. So another slogan I sometimes use is this: adding God to morality turns it upside down.
Yeah.
So that was the argument. Is it clear enough so far?
Yeah, and it's related to an argument that I think a lot of people think about intuitively, and that is, when atheists bring up the problem of evil, how could an all-good, all-powerful God allow so much apparently pointless suffering? The theist will often say something like, well, it has a higher purpose, it's achieving some higher good. And so, if that's the answer, then why should we think that we should go out of our way to try to stop or relieve pointless suffering if it's the will of God that this suffering takes place? It just completely flips upside down morality, just like you say.
Yeah, I think it is a powerful objection, and I've tried to make it even more powerful by insisting that the suffering in question actually benefits the sufferer overall. So it's not simply enough that some overall benefit accrue to the universe if we allow a child to be tortured. I think perfection in God requires something stronger, and there are a number of theists who agree. namely